Imagine gold not just as a precious metal, but as an absolutely secret weapon of the Cold War. Its weight determined not only currency exchange rates, but also the course of revolutions, the destinies of entire states, and the collapse and emergence of new shadow world kings. Today we know that the USSR officially mined tens of tons of gold, but archival documents, testimonies of intelligence officers, and leaks from banking chains paint a very different picture. A parallel economy where every ingot was forbidden currency for secret deals, wars, and blatant betrayal. But what if not all the gold went to the state bank? What if tens of tons settled in bunker storage, in the personal accounts of officers, in embassy safes abroad, and then simply disappeared? In the early 80s, as the struggle for influence in third world countries intensified, the Soviet Union sharply increased its presence in Africa. This clash of ideas, socialism versus capitalism, East versus West, went beyond propaganda. Resources, trade routes, and control over unstable regions with vast natural wealth were at stake. It was then that planes with Soviet crews landed at night in Luanda, the capital of Angola, at an old military airfield. They arrived without identification marks, without registration in international databases, with their onboard lights off, descending in complete darkness. And after a few hours, these planes flew back, loaded with what was not in the warehouses of the USSR Ministry of Defense. Officially, documents spoke of humanitarian aid, spare parts, or communication equipment. In practice, inside were empty metal boxes, securely sealed and welded, which by morning were filled with gold bars. African gold, mined in artisanal mines, seized from rebels or confiscated from private owners, fell into the hands of Soviet officers through a chain of field commanders, local functionaries, and government representatives personally loyal to Moscow. These operations were carried out without unnecessary noise, without warehouses, and without long chains of intermediaries. One flight, one shipment, several tons, not a single extra person. The delivery to the airfield was provided by Cuban units, formally performing security functions. The vehicles arrived with closed bodies under heavy guard. Documents were not checked, and filming was prohibited. KGB officers personally supervised the loading. Departure was scheduled for the morning hours to avoid attention. When the airspace was cleared of civilian aviation, the plane departed via Congo or Algeria, where the aircraft was changed or papers were transferred, and from there it headed either to Taganrog or to one of the secret bases in the southern military district. Not a single ingot passed through the balance of the USSR State Bank. These supplies were not recorded in Soviet statistics. It was parallel financing, hidden from the eyes of even the highest circles of the Politburo. The funds went to special operations abroad, support for friendly regimes, training of foreign fighters, and, as it later turned out, to opaque programs controlled by a narrow group of KGB officers and shadowy foreign economic intelligence curators. Thus began an operation whose scale is still impossible to accurately assess. It is from these silent night landings that our story begins, the story of gold, intelligence, and espionage that crosses borders, eras, and entire governments. But what exactly was hidden in those boxes, and how is it connected to the global struggle for influence? This will lead to the details of the Angolan operation, where ideology masked pragmatic exchange. Angola became one of the main strongholds of Soviet influence on the continent. After gaining independence from Portugal in 1977, the country plunged into a protracted civil war. The main players, the Marxist MPLA party and the anti-communist UNITA, fought not only for power but also for access to natural resources. Moscow bet on the MPLA, ideologically close and open to Soviet advisors within its ranks. Immediately after establishing diplomatic relations, embassy staff appeared in Luanda, followed by military instructors and KGB specialists. However, behind the facade of ideological brotherhood lay an interest in something more tangible. Angola possessed vast reserves of gold, diamonds, oil, iron ore, and other key resources. Many deposits were located in combat zones under the control of local field commanders or rebel groups who sometimes switched to the MPLA side in exchange for weapons. Such instability made resources a powerful tool for political bargaining. Gold stood out particularly. It served as a universal currency, independent of dollar exchange rates, without the need for bank transfers, and without leaving traces. It was this quality that made it ideal for secret deals. The KGB and the Ministry of Defense quickly created a barter system with strict rules: one batch of weapons, an equivalent in gold. Ammunition, small arms, equipment, and later anti-aircraft missile systems all were supplied under the supervision of Soviet specialists. In return, officers of the First Chief Directorate received bars of artisanal processing. Some were remelted with impurities of copper and contaminants. Others were standard in weight and shape but without markings. Everything was recorded in confidential reports that did not go to the state bank but remained within intelligence channels. Thus, in the late 70s and early 80s, a closed exchange system emerged in Africa. The Soviet Union armed the right regimes not for loyalty to ideas, but for real material benefits. This marked a silent shift in foreign policy from aiding fraternal peoples to hard pragmatism, hidden under the guise of internationalism. During this period, the KGB acquired a special mandate for financial operations abroad, bypassing official channels. Gold became not just a resource, but an instrument for waging proxy wars. This scheme worked perfectly in Angola, but it soon spread further. What awaited in Mozambique, where the conflict was even more intense? Mozambique became the next element in the African network. After gaining independence from Portugal in the mid-70s, a protracted civil war broke out there between the Frelimo government and Renamo rebels. The conflict lasted a decade and claimed the lives of over 1 million people by various estimates. As in Angola, the USSR supported Frelimo, seeing it as a reliable partner and carrier of Marxist ideas in the region. But behind the official statements of friendship lay a purely practical line. From the early 80s, groups of Soviet experts, mainly communication specialists and medics, became active in the country. Under the guise of humanitarian tasks, KGB agents from the economic and foreign policy departments operated. Their goal was clear: to establish a systematic exchange of weapons for strategic raw materials, primarily gold and diamonds from the north of the country. The supply schemes differed little from those in Angola. Weapons arrived in Maputo by sea, often disguised as aid, and return cargo left by air under strict intelligence control. A distinctive feature of the Mozambican vector was the active use of ports previously under Portuguese control and the involvement of intermediaries from Southeast Asia. Through them, unofficial channels for resource extraction were used, which masked the USSR's role in complicated tracking for Western services. Gold from Mozambique did not usually fly directly to the Soviet Union, but first to socialist countries of Eastern Europe, primarily the German Democratic Republic and Czechoslovakia. There, it was processed into other batches, remelted, and sent further to Geneva, London, Zurich, or, if necessary, back to the USSR. Control was exercised not by diplomats, but by special plenipotentiaries, KGB officers attached to trade missions and embassies. They oversaw deals and prepared closed financial reports sent directly to the center. Most of these papers were never declassified. Their traces were lost in the archives of the financial and economic department and the personal safes of curators. From the surviving fragments, it is clear: the volumes reached hundreds of millions of dollars at the then current exchange rate, and the gold transported tens of tons. Mozambique showed how a formerly poor, war-torn country could become a source of raw materials for a superpower. In exchange for assault rifles, ammunition, and regime support, it paid with its subsoil, all under the control of foreign intelligence agencies operating outside international law, but with coordination at the government level. If Mozambique was by sea, then Ethiopia became the real scale. How did the USSR gain access to its gold reserves in the midst of the crisis? Ethiopia turned out to be the third and perhaps the most extensive direction in the USSR's African strategy. After the overthrow of the monarchy in the mid-70s, a military council led by Mengistu Haile Mariam came to power. The new regime declared a course towards socialism, but plunged into a severe internal and external crisis: famine, civil war, clashes with Somalia, separatist movements in Eritrea. All this created complete dependence on foreign aid. Moscow saw an opportunity not only to establish itself in the strategic Red Sea region, but also to expand operations honed in Angola and Mozambique. Soviet support for Ethiopia was unprecedented. According to official data, over 50,000 tons of weapons, hundreds of military advisors, aviation, armored vehicles, and air defense systems were sent there. However, such volumes could not be free. especially given the chronic shortage of hard currency in the USSR. In parallel with military assistance, a covert economic line was launched. In exchange for weapons and political protection, the Soviet side gained access to gold mining areas in the south and east, previously under the control of local clans or foreign companies. These areas gradually came under military administration, establishing direct ingot supply channels. Ethiopian gold was of high purity and valued on the world market. Ingots arrived in various forms, raw or manually remelted. They were delivered in diplomatic cargo or through sanitary flights of transport aviation, formally carrying aid or evacuating specialists. The process was controlled by KGB agents under the guise of trade missions or educational programs. Officers of the foreign economic bloc played a special role. Experts on European banks, capital transfer mechanisms, and metal legalization abroad. According to estimates, Ethiopia accounted for at least a third of all African gold that ended up in Soviet hands from the late 70s to the early 90s. The exact volumes are unknown. Documents were destroyed or classified, but indirect data from participant testimonies, press leaks, and archival references indicate tens of tons of high-quality metal not controlled by the State Planning Committee or the Ministry of Finance. Thus, Ethiopia, like Angola and Mozambique, became part of a large-scale covert intelligence and economic operation. Under the guise of ideological support, a financial mechanism was hidden where gold became the currency of influence and an instrument of covert foreign policy financing. The three countries formed a network, but how did this logistics work in practice to avoid the eyes of the West? By the early 80s, the structure of Soviet intelligence operations in Africa had become stable and organized. Formally outside state agreements, they were actually coordinated at the level of the Central Committee of the CPSU, the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the KGB. Supervision was carried out through the First Chief Directorate, with the participation of specialists from other departments, including the Fifth Directorate for the Protection of the Constitutional Order and the Main Directorate for Foreign Economic Activity. Each country had its own scheme. For Angola, aviation was the basis. For Mozambique, sea routes with transshipments through Madagascar or southern Tanzanian ports. For Ethiopia, a mixed route with cargo planes from Addis Ababa and stops in Yemen, Syria, or Algeria. These trajectories served not only for gold export, but also for feedback, transferring instructions, equipment, and arriving coordinators. The common feature was complete secrecy. In each country, special groups were formed. KGB representatives, military intelligence, technicians, and commercial links from foreign economic organizations, formally trading but actually conducting operational logistics. Their task was to collect, verify, package, and dispatch gold without involving local authorities, foreign observers, or the press. Operations were carried out under constant surveillance by Western services, especially the CIA, which tracked aviation, ships, and anonymous flows in European banks. But the scale of the network was such that intercepts were rarely successful. The USSR used not only state channels, but also bribed Western structures through intermediaries. Gold went through stages: verification, sorting, packaging, transport, and distribution. The final destinations varied. Some to the USSR for secret needs such as financing operations, agent work, and black market purchases. Others to Europe, where through shell companies and offshore accounts it was remelted, losing its origin, and entered global circulation. By the mid-80s, the Soviet Union had an autonomous system for exporting metals from Africa, not controlled by financial departments or foreign trade. Everything was decided by a narrow circle connected with the KGB and leadership. The scheme allowed circumventing sanctions, currency shortages, and restrictions, maintaining activity abroad, from proxy wars to ideological projects. This network became the Black Triangle. But what did it mean for global intelligence, and why couldn't the West stop it? By the late 80s, analytical memos from the Central Intelligence Agency and closed reports from Western banks began to speak of the so-called Black Triangle, an unofficial gold movement scheme that ran between Angola, Ethiopia, and Mozambique, with a chain of points in Algeria, Cuba, and Eastern Europe. In essence, it was a transcontinental web that allowed the Soviet Union not only to extract resources, but also to finance external operations, avoiding currency controls, sanctions, and open reporting. Information leaked into banking circles, where unusual activity of metal of dubious origin was recorded. The structure of the triangle was built on the principle of an intelligence cascade. In each country, narrow groups of contacts worked, knowing only their role, but not the entire chain. This minimized leaks and complicated the picture for external services. The geography, conflict zones, weak states, hidden communication channels, facilitated concealment. It was not just export logistics, but a parallel economic reality with its own laws. Of particular concern was that the gold arrived in Europe already cleaned of traces, not through African exchanges, but suddenly in accounts of shell companies in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, or Cyprus. Anomalies in reports, increased private mining, surges in anonymous deposits, fictitious exports hinted at the scale. Western services tried to block the flows, intercepting ships, seizing shipments, interrogating intermediaries. But proving a connection to Moscow failed due to multi-layered protection. Within the Soviet system, access to complete information was limited to a select group: officers of the first chief directorate of the KGB, foreign economic specialists, diplomats through closed channels, and heads of trade associations connected with intelligence. This structure ensured anonymity and personal responsibility. Failure fell on the curator, not the department. Such an approach kept the scheme stable for over a decade. Gold arrived, was processed, dissolved in flows, and the proceeds went to foreign policy projects, from guerrillas in Latin America to black market purchases. The Black Triangle became part of the late USSR's invisible economy and the basis for future changes after its collapse. Gold was not just stored, it fueled wars around the world. Where did it go next? One of the least studied aspects of the African scheme is its connection to proxy conflicts, where the Soviet Union did not participate directly but supported allied forces. These clashes in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East required constant investment in financing, training, weapons, and infrastructure. The official budget did not cover such expenses, so funds were drawn from parallel sources, including gold from Africa. Of particular importance was assistance to movements in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, and Peru, left radical groups oriented towards socialism and supported by Moscow. To circumvent sanctions from the U.S. and its allies, direct transfers and supplies were excluded as a political risk. Instead, anonymous routes through third countries were used with document substitution under the control of officers outside diplomatic protocols. Dozens of individuals officially non-existent in the USSR participated in the operations: illegal agents, technicians, curators. Financing went in cash or through purchases: radio stations, medical equipment, uniforms, food, transport. Everything was acquired not with rubles or through state channels, but through special accounts secured by gold from Angola, Mozambique, or Ethiopia. Thus, an invisible link was established between African subsoils and Central American jungles. A similar model operated in Asia. In Cambodia, Laos, the Philippines, structures were supported that contained the influence of Washington and Beijing. This was costly, but gold allowed circumventing currency funds and government sanctions. Decisions were made on a case-by-case basis, through intelligence officers or closed directives from top leadership. In the Middle East, the system was particularly active. Lebanon, Yemen, and Palestinian camps received constant support. Money did not always come directly from the USSR, sometimes through Eastern Europe, where metal was sold on local markets, and funds were redirected. This created an illusion of locality, but behind it stood a global network. African gold fueled dozens of covert conflicts, changing the destinies of countries and ensuring Moscow's presence where it shouldn't have been. It was the currency of geopolitics, allowing actions without a flag or signature. The West noticed strange flows, but how did they try to penetrate the secret? Throughout the 80s, American and British intelligence services made numerous attempts to understand the essence of what was happening. Interest was not only in the resource for weapon exchange scheme, but also in the methods of subsequent asset monetization. Reports from the Central Intelligence Agency, MI6, and European financial institutions increasingly mentioned an increase in anonymous deposits, the movement of large gold shipments without specifying the source, and a surge in shadow exports from Eastern Europe. Officially, the USSR did not trade gold on global markets. The state bank maintained strict control. Supplies only went through in extreme cases of currency deficit. But data from banking consortia in London, Luxembourg, and Geneva painted a different picture. Since the early 80s, more and more metal without certificates appeared on the markets. During remelting, ingots lost their markings, becoming legally clean and were designated as private or secondary. Western services recorded. Immediately after shipments arrived in Switzerland or Great Britain, suspicious transactions began, opening accounts in offshore companies, purchasing real estate, creating shell funds. Proceeds from sales were dispersed in various directions. Some settled in banks, some went to projects, and the rest disappeared into the gray zone. There was no formal evidence of a connection with Moscow, but indirect signs, recurring intermediaries, routes, logic, pointed to Soviet structures. The involvement of citizens of neutral countries increased concern. Transport was provided by firms from Austria, Finland, Sweden, which allowed the USSR to maintain anonymity and shift blame to private individuals. Moscow actively used a network of shell legal entities created in advance under the guise of trading equipment, textiles, or rare metals, but in reality legalizing gold. The Central Intelligence Agency attempted to infiltrate agents into the chains, but stable channels were not established. When a leak was threatened, operations were shut down. Personnel changed and routes were adjusted. The network was decentralized with distributed management. The failure of one cell did not stop others. This made the structure typical for intelligence and almost invulnerable. In the West, there was a growing realization that the USSR had built a shadow turnover mechanism that financed operations parallel to the official economy. A separate world of finance, intelligence, and politics with gold at its center, dissolved without a trace of origin. Gold dissolved in Europe. How exactly did the USSR legalize it through allies? By the late 80s, it became clear in the London and Geneva markets that gold of unknown origin had turned into a stable flow. Officially, its share seemed insignificant, but in reality, the number of anonymous suppliers not connected with traditional miners grew. Behind this were planned operations based on African ingots, remelted and integrated into trade. The process was particularly active through Eastern Europe. Warsaw Pact countries, primarily the German Democratic Republic, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria, served not just as transit points. Key legalization took place on their territory. Gold was delivered through secret channels, where it was remelted and processed as local production. Although the actual volumes of their own production were small, Soviet reporting allowed them to enter the required figures into plans. Ingots received new hallmarks, passports, and certificates, after which they were exported to Western Europe as legal goods. The mechanisms were impressive. State banks, metallurgical plants, foreign economic associations, intermediaries, and insurers were involved. Everything looked like normal export, but in reality masked the source. In the same countries, fictitious representative offices were created, on which accounts were opened and from which transfers were made. The gold flow turned into a monetary one, returning to the USSR or to desired regions. Part of the proceeds settled in Europe, in banks in Liechtenstein, Austria, Belgium, in closed accounts of third-country shell individuals. These accounts avoided taxes and audits, protected by local laws, and were used for operational needs, paying for secret actions, purchasing equipment, influencing officials, supporting lobbyists in international organizations. The remaining funds returned not directly, but through chains of fake contracts. Consumer goods, medicines, computers, laboratory equipment were purchased. Everything was registered as currency transactions, but in essence, it was for gold, bypassing trade barriers. Thus, the USSR gained access to technologies and strategic goods. Western services lost control over a segment of the economy. The system was multi-layered, relying on the weakness of global oversight, bureaucracy, the secrecy of Soviet structures, and the benefits for participants. It held on until the very foundation of the Union began to crack. But where was the gold stored within the USSR outside official balances? Within the Soviet Union, the issue of storing strategic gold reserves always remained under the highest classification. The official reserve was managed by the state bank with accounting, control, and security. But with the development of external operations like the African one, the need arose for alternative facilities, not reflected in reports and subordinate to intelligence, not banks. According to former KGB and Ministry of Defense employees, a significant portion of African gold did not reach central Moscow warehouses. It was stored at secret bases in Moscow, Ryazan, Novosibirsk, and Chita regions. Dual-use facilities combining arms and valuable storage. Access was limited to a few with special clearance and personal permission from the KGB chief or the Minister of Defense. There were also underground premises in mines, not marked on open maps, providing protection and anonymity. Sometimes gold was not kept in ingots, but processed into plates, parts, or raw material, complicating identification. In addition to stationary storage, part of the reserves was in mobile storage, containers on ships, trains, or air bases, constantly moved with changing locations and personnel. This was used for mobility during urgent operations or in case of leaks. Reserves were not listed in reports and balances. The highest secrecy concerned batches abroad, ingots as collateral in Swiss or Luxembourg banks for loans to third countries, or anonymous cells accessible to 2 or 3 persons from foreign intelligence. This served as insurance in case of isolation, crisis, or the need for independent financing. The most controversial legends concern illegal storage outside the system, controlled by a narrow group not always from official structures. It is assumed that part of the African gold ended up in the personal interests of curators with traces lost in the early 90s. If they existed, they are now either lost or in private hands under new guises in the ruins of the system. This system worked for decades, but what happened when the Union began to crumble? The collapse of the Soviet Union was not just a blow to politics and economics. It destroyed all parallel systems that operated in the shadows without a center. The collapse occurred in 1991, and the financial structure built by the KGB and foreign economic bodies held on by inertia for some time, but soon fragmented. In this chaos, the fate of African gold became a subject of struggle among former intelligence officers and the new elite that emerged from privatization. Warehouses in the former territory fell into uncertainty. Some were disbanded, looted, or transferred to new security structures. In others, the metal simply disappeared. Containers were transported out under the guise of secret cargo, documents were destroyed, and personnel who knew the routes and volumes were dismissed or sent into the civilian sphere with silent consent not to interfere. Reporting was either absent or burned in the first months of 1992. Everything not accounted for dissolved without a trace. Foreign assets became particularly valuable: accounts, collateral, cells under strawmen and offshore entities. Some former employees gained access, quickly transitioning to business, consulting, export, private banks, formally new, but in reality continuations of Soviet schemes. They used old connections to legalize, invest, buy enterprises, or real estate. The origin of funds was not discussed. In the early 90s, the banking community turned a blind eye to the mass inflow from the former USSR, preferring to remain silent. According to Western research, by 1994, a significant portion of foreign gold had been withdrawn, transferred to personal accounts in London and Zurich, into Asian funds or post-Soviet structures. Those who managed the operations were the same ones who oversaw operations through the KGB, Bank, and Goskomnadzor. They were well versed in the system, documents, whom to pay, and whom to beware of. This allowed them to convert state assets into personal capital in the shortest possible time. African gold, a reserve of the USSR for decades, went out of control over the years, settling in private hands, offshore accounts, or cells whose owners preferred to remain silent. This story is not only about intelligence and geopolitics, but also about how billions created by the system became the spoils of those who were the first to take advantage of its collapse. Who exactly seized these assets, and how did they become the foundation for a new elite? After the collapse, the names of former special services and foreign economic agency employees who suddenly found themselves at the helm of large private structures, banks, investment companies, export-import firms, came into the focus of journalists and investigators. Many had experience working in Africa, the Middle East, or Warsaw Pact countries, but had no public biographies. Their names did not appear in official sources, and their starting capital remained uncommented. Former foreign intelligence officers possessing data on resource export routes and foreign assets became key in the transition of gold from state to private ownership. They not only knew about the reserves, but had contacts with banks where accounts and cells had been opened back in Soviet times. In the early 90s, these connections turned into capital and operations, into quiet privatization. Everything happened without noise. Signatures in offices, documents in briefcases with the escort of former agents under diplomatic passports. Many deals went through offshore entities for anonymous registration. Companies in Cyprus, Panama, or Seychelles became owners of former state assets. Old structures were used, trade missions, associations, trading houses created in the 80s under intelligence cover. Documentation was partially destroyed, partially lost in reorganization, nullifying the origin. Western journalists noted the speed with which these people went from unknown to major players. They were united by their past in foreign policy structures and their skills in working outside the official economy, conspiracy, disguise, knowledge of financial mechanisms. This made them invulnerable in the first years after the collapse. In fact, they became the first capitalists of New Russia, transforming shadow assets into legal circulation. Almost no public traces remained. Contracts, agreements, codes, and routes were stored in the memory of a narrow circle. Those who tried to uncover the scheme encountered silence or disappeared from view. Gold from African dust, secretly transported, formed the foundation of post-Soviet billionaires. Without investors, IPOs, or presentations, only on information, connections, and lack of control. This is related to the party gold. What was it, and where did it go? The connection of African gold with the disappeared flows of the late 80s is particularly evident in the history of party gold, a concept shrouded in rumors and official silence. It refers to the assets of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, withdrawn abroad in the last years of its existence. The exact volumes, storage, and routes are unknown, but many believe that part of it was formed from African gold. Officially, the party had no right to engage in foreign economic activity, but it controlled commercial organizations, foreign trade associations, cultural foundations, friendship representative offices, scientific and technical centers. Through them went currency operations, fictitious contracts, and funds under the guise of international cooperation. In reality, instruments for withdrawing assets, including gold exchanged for weapons in Angola, Mozambique, and Ethiopia. From 1988 onwards, amidst crisis and instability, a hasty redeployment abroad began. This was overseen by informal groups within the Central Committee apparatus with the support of intelligence and financial specialists. Funds were transferred to accounts in Europe and Asia through shell companies and banks in neutral countries. It is difficult to separate party money from intelligence money. They went in parallel through the same channels and people. Part of the gold was used as collateral for loans, contracts, and supplies. Another part remained in reserves dispersed in Eastern Europe, Cyprus, or the Middle East. After the collapse, these assets went out of control. They did not enter the balances of new states, were not mentioned in agreements, and effectively disappeared. Later, media reported on attempts to recover or document traces. Gold resurfaced in shipments from private structures with dubious histories. Banks refused to provide data on old accounts from 1991. But investigations stalled in the labyrinths of law, offshore entities, and lost archives. The history of party gold intersects with African gold under KGB control. They are united by a secret economy based on distrust of channels, dependence on politics, and anonymity. Some see this as a loss of property, others as the birth of a system where power lies in access to hidden resources. Decades have passed, but the echoes are visible today. How does this affect modern Russia and Africa? Decades have passed. The Soviet Union is in the past, its ideas forgotten, and its gold dissolved into global capital. But the echo of history can be traced in geopolitics, economics, and diplomacy. Africa, once a battlefield for superpowers, is once again attracting players. Ironically, the Russian Federation is increasing its presence in those very countries where Soviet groups operated decades ago and secretly transported tons of gold: Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia. Embassies are opening, military agreements are being concluded, and infrastructure projects are being discussed. This is seen as Moscow's strategy to regain its positions. However, analysis shows similarities. Logistics, routes, even partners often match those of the 80s. The legacy has proven resilient. Experts note parallels in forms, again without direct investment, with barter, a focus on gold, uranium, and rare metals. If previously in the Cold War, then now in the global competition for resources, routes, and influence. The logic is the same. Minimum publicity, maximum secrecy, focus on results. The personnel connection is surprising. Descendants of those who served in the African direction now lead consortia, think tanks, and export agencies. They know the languages, the mentality, whom and how much to pay for deals. These figures are rarely in the media, but they are key in building bridges between Moscow and the continent. Western analysts see this as a revival of the old model, adapted to modern times. The question of the fate of Soviet gold from Africa in the 70s and 80s remains open. Perhaps some of the funds still fuel unofficial operations today, covering expenses outside the budget, or have long since merged into the new economy where the boundaries between state and private are blurred. The scheme has survived the times. Participants have either gone into the shadows or into the elite, traces are hidden by corporate veils, but the logic lives on. In a world of information control and resource power, such schemes only change their form. But how much gold was there really, and why does the truth remain hidden? Attempts to estimate the volumes of gold exported from Africa are hampered by the lack of documents. Soviet reporting had a double, sometimes triple level of secrecy. KGB papers were not stored in general archives, did not go to the state bank, and were usually destroyed after their tasks were completed. Rare fragments, ciphergrams, receipts, acts, were manual and unrecorded. Sources are indirect: surges in European banks, reports from Western services, participant recollections, data from socialist bloc archives. They suggest tens, possibly hundreds of tons. For comparison, annual production in the USSR in the 80s was about 200 tons. Even 20 to 30 from Africa is a significant portion outside the balance. It is important that the ingots were non-standard, without hallmarks, did not undergo refining, and easily merged with the market as secondary metal or private production. Part went into jewelry, the East for culture and economy, or into defense for instruments for export. Channels concealed volumes and the fact. It is symbolic that commissions of inquiry in the Union and Russia never completed their work. Parliamentary and public attempts were stalled by a lack of evidence or political will. Disclosure would have meant names, structures, sources. Not a scandal, but a re-evaluation of the era. The story of African gold is a closed chapter at the intersection of intelligence, economics, politics, and the shadow world that follows, despite changes. It is a mirror of power mechanisms, redistribution, and the disappearance of fortunes. For over 10 years, the USSR built a network of secret operations where gold was currency outside sanctions and control, solving the tasks of the official economy. After the collapse, the system changed. Sources are in the shadows or the elite. Gold is in offshore accounts or funds, possibly in warehouses for the future. The logic remains. Control of resources outside the system provides power over opportunities. Reconstructing details runs into the silence of archives, participants, and intermediary countries. Perhaps it is for the best. Too much is at stake. But behind the silence, there is the rustle of papers, the clinking of metal, sounds from the depths. The story waits for the door to be opened. An operation without shots provided them worldwide. Without heroes, only those who knew where the gold was and what could be bought with it.